Hello, this is Pino, and I am recording my presentation on teacher personality and student academic outcomes. This research topic was selected for a literature review for Dr. Darren Shalacombe's class, Experimental Methods, fall semester 2024. So the purpose of an annotated bibliography is to provide a research overview. So what typically happens is that a student or researcher will select a topic and they will summarize the current research to determine what has already been done, if their the research questions have already been answered, and then you want to identify the gaps in literature. So I selected 15 sources from the Forsyth database. Some are journal articles, some are book chapters, a few dissertations actually in there. They are all going to be reviewed in the scope of this presentation. So my research area comes from my experience as an elementary school teacher over the past several years. I've always been curious about the way that teachers conduct classrooms, the way they manage their classrooms, and how it impacts student outcomes. So I was looking at what is the relationship between teacher personality and student outcomes. I used Baumrine's parenting styles, the authoritarian, authoritative, or permissive parent. My intent was to see if there was a transfer between parenting styles to teaching styles, because I know with parenting styles that authoritative parents, for example, are the most effective parents. So does that mean authoritative teachers are the most effective teachers? And finally, I'm interested in looking into whether or not personality traits, particular personality traits like extroversion, are associated with student academics. So it's academic achievement in particular, not just general student outcomes. So this topic has practical applications. I think that it's relevant, especially to the field of education, because if personality is in fact associated with academic outcomes for students, then that means that we should sort of change the selection and recruitment process around how we hire teachers, right? So if we find out, for example, that maybe teacher conscientiousness is associated with higher test scores, you would maybe ask interview questions about that. You may want to provide training about that for teachers. This is particularly important for students because you want them to achieve well, and if personality can influence achievement, then in turn, students will have better career and economic prospects. The next 15 slides will be a review of every source that I selected for the annotated bibliography. We're going to discuss, I'll provide a citation, a summary of the source, and then a critique and the relevance to my research area. So the first study that I reviewed was not a meta-analysis, but a literature review. It took 41 academic papers and it looked at the relationship between teacher self-reported empathy and student outcomes. It was not strictly educational or academic outcomes. So some of the problems with the study, empathy was like a really narrow construct for personality, because I was thinking more of like the Big Five personality inventory, where they covered extroversion, openness, agreeableness, all of that. So it was a pretty narrow focus, very small sample size, low statistical power because of that. And it was relevant, though. It is relevant to my research because it does measure teacher personality, even though it's a self-report and that introduces bias. And it does measure outcomes for students, but not academic outcomes. A lot of studies are similar to this. They do not measure academic outcomes at all, or they measure other student outcomes like engagement or motivation. This study was a dissertation, and it looked at student academic outcomes for early childhood, specifically kindergarten through third grade, and the relationship with academic performance. So what they did is they hypothesized that emotional regulation and maternal warmth would predict a better relationship with between students and their kindergarten teachers, and that in turn would increase academic outcomes. And what they found was a positive correlation with the emotional regulation, but it was a longitudinal study, and by the time they got to third grade, it was no longer relevant. And maternal warmth was not significant. Some problems with this study is that it's not generalizable to older students. It's longitudinal, so some factors can change over time through the course of kindergarten through third grade and create some issues, which would be hard to tease out that may influence academic achievement. And I do think it is relevant because it reinforces the importance of early relationships and student-teacher relationships on academic achievement. But, a lot of these studies are using the word relationship when I did the query on Forsyth instead of personality kind of coming up as a key word. So my question is relationship and personality. Are they interchangeable terms? Probably not, but does personality influence the type of relationship, and if so, how? This study was out of Chile, and it was a longitudinal study that was conducted on high school students about how relationships with teachers could potentially improve academic outcomes. Just a couple of problems with this. High school students and elementary school students are totally different developmentally, and so this may not be generalizable to younger students, but the relevance to the research was like spot on because it looked at the relationship between teacher and student and academic achievement. So it basically has the independent variable and the dependent variable that I'm looking for. However, once again, personality is not really mentioned. Personality is implied by the teacher-student relationship. So there's an overlap with the research area, but it's kind of missing some support for the independent variable. This study is out of Pakistan. It is an academic journal article, and it is from a university. And the findings show that there's a significant relationship between 4 personality traits and student academic performance. I think it was 4 out of the big five inventory personality traits. However, once again, I thought this was a really interesting article because it basically encompasses everything that I'm looking for in the research area and addresses my research questions and overlaps with my variables almost perfectly. However, there are some cultural differences, right? And so how students in a Muslim society respond to a teacher's personality may be totally different from what happens here in the States. So the cultural context is the issue, but the variables are spot on. Yeah. This source was a book chapter about how college students perceive their professors and then how they evaluate them based on perceptions, like the end of year evaluations or the end of semester evaluations that we get. This is more of a descriptive study, so it's sort of lacking some empirical evidence. It is not generalizable to younger groups because college students are not children, which is sort of outside of the age range that I'm interested in. But there are a ton of really good citations that support the influence of professor personality and the way that students perceive them instead of being a teacher self-report, which I'm, finding a lot in the research and not a ton of student self-report. So perception and perspective on personality matters based on who you're asking. So this study is out of Canada. It's a correlational study that looked at English language learners in Canada and how they deal and adjust with having learning from authoritarian teachers in the classroom. So part of the problem with this article is that it addresses the way that students are coping with the teacher and not academic outcomes. What I do like about this study is it's like one of the first ones to mention authoritarian teaching style. And what I'm really interested in is that sort of that bomb rind concept of the style of teaching, and I didn't see any other studies use this language when I looked it up. So some of the limitations are not a lot of strong empirical support. It is based on theory. So just a few of these studies have really looked at this topic from the lens of pre-existing theory. So that provides some strength to the research, and it's not generalizable to other groups of students, only really to English language learners. I would like to see a study like this that is less focused on how students cope and more directed at how authoritarian teaching style affects academic outcomes. This is a study that I really liked. It was from Texas A&M, a correlational study. So a longitudinal study. It tracked students over time, and it looked for a correlation between teacher warmth, teacher and student conflict, and then the dependent variable was academic achievement and academic engagement. Like a lot of studies, achievement is often included as a dependent variable alongside of other student outcomes that are like social, emotional learning, engagement, motivation, self-efficacy, stuff like that. So not a lot of attention to the dependent variable that I'm interested in, but it did touch on it. Also, thinking about the conflict issue and the relationship there. Conflict is not a personality trait, but it can apply certain personality traits. Finally, this is a good study because it tracks relationships over time. They're not just looking at academic outcomes and engagement in one point in time. It was conducted with at-risk, low socioeconomic middle school students, so there's some generalizability issues there. But it did have some practical applications because, if warmth does lead to academic engagement, which in turn leads to academic achievement, then we need to work on building relationships with students in middle schools. This study was really interesting because there was almost complete overlap with the research area and the problem that I'm interested in. It is a journal article, a correlational study, longitudinal also, about the relationship between teacher personality and two things, student self-efficacy and student academic achievement. However, it was conducted, a small sample size, and it was conducted with high school students, so not totally generalizable, but there was some strong statistical analysis, and the findings are really interesting. Looks like conscientiousness and agreeableness were associated with personal support of students, but I have to note here that personal support is not academic achievement, so it could be that personal support could lead to a better relationship, which could lead to higher academic achievement. And for the first time, neuroticism, which is no surprise, is associated with a student decrease in self-efficacy, which could in turn lead to a decrease in student academic achievement. I do really like this Big Five personality trait as an instrument for measuring personality because it is a reliable and valid resource for measuring personality. Like literature, yeah. All right, this is a super fantastic study because it overlaps almost exactly entirely with the research problem that I presented. It includes the independent variable, which is teacher personality, which is it's all Big Five personality traits, research, 25 studies using that instrument, which helps to control for statistical errors when the DV, the dependent variable, is the same throughout the studies that are combined for the meta-analysis. Teacher effectiveness, though, was the dependent variable. So the assumption is made that teacher effectiveness is going to support stronger academic student outcomes. So it would be, there's just like so much in this data. It's hard to disaggregate like just the academic achievement part of it, but it did indicate that agreeableness was not associated with teacher effectiveness, which contradicts the previous study. Another great thing about this study is that it covers kindergarten through 12th grade. So it's like good, also a good large sample size. This was a really interesting study because it looked at preschool children and how their perception of relationships affected their social skills and academic achievement. Usually studies look at, especially if they're really young, teacher self-report of personality or teacher report of the relationships with students. I don't know how they did this. I should have looked into it more, but because like they're talking to 3 and 4-year-olds about their perceptions of their teachers. And so what they found in this study is that a lot of the students who perceive their relationships with their teachers as negative did not have very good academic outcomes. But teachers, when they were surveyed, perceived that same relationship as dependent and not negative. So the reason I like this study is because it sort of unpacks how important it is to think about perception and how perception of personality or perception of relationships can affect the results of a research study. This is probably one of the weakest sources that is included in this bibliography. It is a book chapter which looks at how personality traits of teachers impact their communication, particularly with colleagues. There is a teacher assessment in there, which I took. What I found was interesting were the traits that they measured because they were totally different than what's found in the Big Five inventory. Amiable, expressive, analytical, and driver personalities, which just further reinforces that there are just like a wealth of ways to measure personality. So one of the problems with looking at all this research is how are you measuring personality? Because it's not always consistent across the board and there's so many different ways to measure personality. But this would be good for some descriptive insight about how teacher personality can be measured. I think that this dissertation from 1971 is the most comical study, only because it is, it's just so dated and really any of the findings would not be, it's lacking external validity because it's not generalizable at all. It's definitely a product of the time. It's 53 years old and it was a study on the relationship between teacher personality and student achievement, which is great. It addresses both of my variables, but it's incredibly dated. It was conducted on like 10 PE teachers and over 1,000 white male students in the Northeast of the United States. So the findings may not be totally relevant, but at the time, I think that it provided some pretty good insight into some early insight into this topic. This study is a longitudinal research conducted with students from pre-kindergarten to age 3, and it looked at their relationships with their teachers and how that predicted academic outcomes all the way from pre-kindergarten to 3rd grade. And it looks like there was a positive relationship between those things. However, high-quality teacher-child relationships, I'm not exactly sure how that's operationalized or defined. And what I'm looking for is how personality predicts academic outcomes. But teacher-child relationships, if they're quality, could be a proxy for, personality traits that are desirable. This study it's called an editorial, and I didn't know what that was until I read this. I mean, in the context of psychology research. So the purpose of this was to look at teacher personality factors and how it influences success in the classroom and just collect information about the topic so that researchers could then generate a new research based on what's already been established, kind of like this annotated bibliography. So this was strong because, wow, it really covered a lot of different personality factors. There's like a list of personality factors that were not mentioned in other studies. And there's like a lot of variety in the research. They looked at not just like elementary school teachers, but college professors and substitute teachers. But it's not a meta-analysis, so it's lacking in scientific data. It is a broad overview of the topic, so I think it was more instructive in terms of what different personality factors are and how it affects mostly, honestly, teacher burnout and teacher success, not student success. So good for the independent variable only. The study is another dissertation that examined teacher personality and the impact on student outcomes, and it did include academic performance. So the great part of that is that it addressed both of the variables that I'm interested in, and it did not find a statistically significant correlation between these variables, which contradicts some of the other studies that I've looked at. And I'm thinking the reason for that is because the sample size was a small rural high school in Texas. So that could account for the difference. But really interesting study. More of the focus was on student motivation and less on academic achievement. In summary, the previous research, all of the sources addressed generally knowledge about how a teacher's personality influences student outcomes. The research was correlational, associational, a couple of meta-analyses, and then some descriptive research, particularly around teacher personality in general. There were no true experiments, and there were just, a few sources that addressed the research problem entirely, right? They either had the dependent variable or the independent variable, and sometimes they had both, but it was missing a complete correspondence with my research questions. There was a huge range of participants all the way from pre-K to university level students. Okay, so if I was to distill personality findings down to just a few topics, I would say this: teacher and student perceptions of teacher personality are different, and perception really matters. Teacher personality is usually measured by teacher self-report, it includes a lot of bias. And then in very few studies, student perception of teacher personality was measured, which also includes bias. I think that there needs to be more research about teacher personality through observation by a third party that's a little bit more objective. There are a lot of different personality metrics that were used to measure personality, but the Big Five inventory was the most popular one. I do want to just address the role of moderating variables. Personality and teacher-student relationships didn't always have a direct relationship with academic outcomes or any kind of outcomes for students. So what happened is that engagement, other outcomes were measured. Engagement was measured. Motivation was measured for students. Classroom self-efficacy was measured. Grit was measured. Classroom management was measured. But they were treated as separate variables or separate outcomes, when I really feel like what was happening is that those variables moderated the relationship. They were like intervening variables or moderating the relationship between teacher personality and academic outcomes. Some other interesting themes around personality that were found in the research were the way that personality was defined. So when I was searching this in the Forsyth database and I typed in teacher personality, what came up were some articles about or sources about teacher personality, but more that referred to relationships between teacher and students, which I think implies that personality involves. Teacher efficacy and effective teaching were some other terms that were synonyms for, I believe, personality or could be linked to personality. So the language is something that I think if I would pursue this as research, would need to be more precise about. Also, when personality was measured, it is a very loaded construct. There are some broad studies that would measure like general personality traits, especially those Big Five traits, but then there were some very specific studies with very specific samples. There was one on just empathy and how empathy impacted student outcomes, and one on just warmth, and one on just agreeableness. So for future research, you could either go more specific with different personality traits, or you could go broad, but maybe have a broad sample size as well. It's really important to emphasize here that in the study of teacher personality and personality in general, that perspective really does matter. If you ask a teacher to self-report their personality, they may not report it accurately. They may have, a different personality at school than they do at home. If you ask a student to report on a teacher's personality, they all might perceive the teacher differently than the teacher perceives themselves, or they might perceive them differently than another peer would perceive the teacher. So I think observation of third parties of teacher personality might sort of help balance this perspective. The one interesting finding is that there is no one-to-one correspondence between how a teacher perceives their own personality and how a student perceives their personality. So that could be an area for future research about, how self-perception, there's a huge discrepancy with how others perceive you and, what are the similarities and differences there. And then just a little note on measurement. The Big Five survey kept coming up repeatedly, but there are other ways to measure personality traits that are found in the research. Okay. So in my research, the role of relationships and teacher-student relationships and quality versus, conflictual teacher-student relationships kept coming up. So really, I'm not going to read these questions, but I do have some more questions for future research about how personality and the role of relationships overlap. Just a little bit of information on the dependent variable, which was academic outcomes. So there was more studies on teacher personality and other student outcomes. Academic outcomes was either like lumped in with social and emotional outcomes, or it just wasn't a singular dependent variable. Most of the studies were longitudinal, even though some of them were short-term. Dependent variable was measured academic outcomes. There's like the Wechsler intelligence test, and sometimes they were just like map scores, and sometimes they were scores that represented a single point in time, and sometimes they represented multiple points in time. So some of the synonyms that were used for academic outcomes are performance, success, and achievement. Okay. So some of the themes that I found throughout the research was sample size. Many of them were small samples or convenience samples, especially in dissertations, which does really maybe would explain why there was very conflicting results from all of these studies. Also, some of these studies were not generalizable because they were limited to specific age groups. A lot of them were just focusing on high school students or just focusing on pre-K students or even university students, and so you can't just relate results between like a developmental span that large. So I would say overall, many of these studies did have limited external validity, but in the meta-analyses especially, the authors would use statistical controls if the sample size or composition was not adequate. Another issue that's probably addressed in most to all research studies are confounding variables. So the relationship between teacher personality and student academic outcomes could vary because of a variety of demographic things like race, ethnicity, age, grade level, teacher area of specialization. There are just so many different variables that needed to be controlled for. One study was just low socioeconomic status, at-risk youth, so you couldn't necessarily apply those results to students that are, more well-off. So there were limitation sections in most of them. Full control is, of course, impossible because, it's not a true experiment. But there was an inclusion of various perspectives and an addendum in the limitation section that stated, okay, we could do better, which is very academically honest. So the overall takeaway from this research is that personality can be related to different student outcomes, not necessarily academic achievement. It really just depends on the study. So there was no total intersection. I did put a Venn diagram here because if you look at the middle of the Venn diagram, that's sort of the overlap with my research area. So a lot were different because of samples or because of the independent and dependent variables and the way that they were defined. But they're just conflicting results. So some showed a positive relationships between the two variables. Some show no relationships. Some show no statistically significant relationships. So there was, like a minor relationship. So I think this area, this topic is still ripe for more research. Maybe that we can, replicate some of the studies to see if we get the same results, or maybe we can, do more longitudinal studies with larger sample sizes. But overall, just like the results were mixed. Okay. Just another major takeaway, the Big Five inventory for personality was used. It's displayed here in the picture on the right. So there was a lot of attention paid to these different personality types within the model and how they were associated or correlated with student academic achievement. Sometimes it was positive, sometimes it was negative, sometimes not at all. So there were some gaps in the literature, which sort of opens up a path for future research. A lot of the studies were very specific with small sample sizes, specific grade levels. So in the future, a full K-12 study could be done that's longitudinal to look at the relationship between these variables. And because the findings are mixed, the more that we contribute to the bank of research that already exists, the more that we can sort of solidify what direction the relationship is going. For future research, I would say, because most of these research studies involve teacher self-reported personality, what needs to happen to provide a balanced perspective on the impact of personality is a combination of teacher self-report, student report, and third-party observation. And then finally, attention to context-dependent personality. So, I'm just thinking, when a teacher self-reports what their personality is, you have to be specific about, is it in the classroom and what does that look like, right, in the classroom? Because personality, and I think there's a future slide about this, is also something that is not always an observable behavior, and it can change because it's fluid. It can change from context to context, so attention should be paid to that. Finally, I don't even know if this is possible to do an experiment to sort of establish a relationship between the two variables. Cause and effect would be ideal. I think I already mentioned this before, but I think future research should pay attention to the inert aspects of personality. So we need to look at how personality of teachers manifest as communication and interaction in the classroom. Also shift the focus from personality to observable behaviors in the classroom. Maybe that's why I wasn't finding a lot of information on personality, because it doesn't always, in the classroom look like what it is internally. So I didn't see any research that mimicked Baumrine's parenting styles as the authoritative, authoritarian, and permissive styles. I think that's something that still could be researched. I would love to research that, given the opportunity. The influence of other non-cognitive aspects of the teacher. There are other non-cognitive aspects, not just personality, but attitudes, beliefs, values. I'm sure there's other research out there that probably exists on that. The role of confounding variables, because so much of this research was specific to certain demographics. We really need to use, I guess, good statistical controls or get a better, more representative sample in order for this research to be reliable and valid. And finally, one author mentioned this, I thought it was interesting, that, well, how about the personality of peers and parents? If teachers' personality could influence a student's academic achievement, how does the role of the personality of peers and parents impact their achievement as well? Okay, this is the area that I am most interested in for future research. It's a question that I was asking over and over as I was reading these research articles is, okay, so the relationship between a teacher's personality and a student's academic achievement is not an A equals B proposition. One does not cause the other. I don't think that's what's going on. It's much more nuanced than that. So I'm thinking, if I were to do this research, I would look at these variables. I would really pay attention to a lot of the moderating variables between the personality and the academic achievement. Like, for example, does teacher personality create increased engagement, enthusiasm, motivation, stability in the classroom, which then leads to academic achievement? Like, what is the mechanism behind how that personality works and could potentially create better academic outcomes, or in the case of neuroticism, decrease academic outcomes. There's something that happens in between these two constructs. I noticed in the research that, I think good research uses theory as a sort of solid foundation from which to base the problem or how you conduct the study. So I noticed that one author used the theory of self-determination, and I'm thinking here, like, what are some theories that could be incorporated into this study to determine the outcomes? I was thinking of Maslow's hierarchy, wondering if our students from low-income backgrounds, do they need the teacher? Who needs these relationships more? Who needs certain personality traits more, right? Is it the kids that are younger? Is it the kids that are at risk? Or like, I'm really curious about, like, if your needs are not met, do you need specific personality traits from an instructor or a specific type of relationship? And also the stages of child development could be incorporated as theory, as a foundation for this, because I've noticed that your relationship with adults and the way that you respond to adult personalities changes as you grow, right? Like, younger children are more responsive to primary caregivers, and older children might not, respond the same way to a teacher's personality and influence as a younger student was. So I guess the research would be the role of perception based on a perception of the teacher's personality based on the age of the student. Another area for future research which interests me is, like I said earlier, the manifestation of personality in the classroom and how students respond to the manifestation of those personality traits, and how the student's personality impacts the perception of the teacher's personality. I think, I'm not positive, but I think this is called dyadic or bidirectional research. I had to look it up. So I think this research needs to be looked at in terms of interaction, not the assumption that one causes the other, not necessarily that one is correlated with the other without any sort of back and forth sort of exchange happening in between teachers and students. So, and when I was in sociology, they called this symbolic interactionism. So it's really, personality is complex, and I think qualitative research, which I think is really interesting, should be sort of the new paradigm, kind of shift the paradigm on this to kind of discover how, like the dialogue and the relationship between the teacher and the student, and how their personality traits come through, and how it's like a dance, right? It's more of a dance than it is sort of like a one singular direction. So this wraps up my presentation of the annotated bibliography about teacher personality and student academic outcomes. And I just wanted to include a quote which captures why I'm interested in this topic. Every child deserves a champion, an adult who will never give up on them, who understands the power of connection and insists they become the best they can possibly be. Connection is something that I think is conveyed and strengthened through personality. So it's something that children deserve, and if it can help them to achieve academically, then it will help them to achieve in life generally.